All right, let's dive into drug development today. And specifically when it jumps from phase 1 to phase 2 trials.
Okay.
I know a lot of you have been curious about, well, how does it shift from, like, is this safe to does this thing actually work?
Right, right.
So let's try and break it down.
Yeah.
Sort of like, imagine you have a new drug, it's promising, passed all the safety tests, but now we got to see if it delivers, you know?
Yeah, that's right. It's a little bit like graduating from basic training to actually going out into the field.
Okay, so before we jump ahead to phase 2, let's just do a quick recap of what phase 1 is all about. It's all about safety first, right?
Exactly. Phase one is really like a meticulous detective just investigating every nook and cranny. You know, we're looking at tolerability, side effects, and how the drug moves throughout the body.
Right,
Absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion, or ADME for short.
right.
Researchers can actually track the drug's journey using radio-labeled molecules.
Wow,
So it's like giving the drug a tiny little GPS tracker.
that's wild. So phase 1 will give us a detailed itinerary for the drug and help determine the safest and most effective dose for future studies.
Yeah.
So then comes phase 2, and that's where we shift the focus to efficacy.
Mm-hmm.
So what actually changes, like in terms of the study goals and design?
The main difference is that we're actually now directly assessing the drug's impact on the targeted disease.
Right.
Instead of just a small group of volunteers, phase 2 trials usually have a larger, more diverse group of patients.
Gotcha.
So that gives us a much better picture of how the drug performs in more like a real-world setting.
That makes sense. We need a bigger sample size to really get a clearer picture of its efficacy.
Exactly.
But how do we even measure if a drug is actually doing its job?
Right.
What are the metrics or the yardsticks that we use?
Right. Well, that's where we have these efficacy endpoints come in. And these are very specific, measurable outcomes that reflect the desired effect of the drug.
Okay.
So imagine if you're trying to measure the effectiveness of like a new fertilizer. You wouldn't just look at how tall the plants grow. You'd also want to measure yield and quality and resistance to pests, those kind of things.
So the efficacy endpoints are like choosing the right measuring tool for the job. You need the right yardstick to actually assess whether the drug is hitting its target.
Precisely.
Yeah.
The endpoints will definitely change and vary depending on the disease and how the drug works. Like, for example, in a trial for a new diabetes drug,
Okay.
a really key efficacy endpoint might be reduction in blood sugar levels.
Makes sense.
But in a cancer trial, it might be tumor shrinkage or even increase in survival time.
Okay, so we've defined these endpoints and we're tracking them during phase 2.
Yeah.
But can we get any hints about if the drug is working before the whole study is done? Like, are there any little indicators, I guess, sneak peeks?
Yes, there can be.
Oh, really?
We call these early indicators of benefit.
Right.
And they can offer really valuable insights. But, it's important to interpret them cautiously.
Right.
Sometimes we observe trends in the data as it comes in. For example, let's say we're seeing a steady decrease in blood pressure in a hypertension trial. Well, that could be a good early sign.
It's like watching a puzzle kind of come together piece by piece. But
Yeah.
like you said, you don't want to jump to conclusions too early.
Exactly. We need to let the data mature a bit and see if the early trends hold up.
Exactly.
In addition to these trends, another really strong early indicator can be what are called biomarkers. And these are specific biological measures that can indicate a response to the drug at like a molecular level.
Okay, so if a drug is, let's say it's designed to block a protein, we might actually measure the levels of that protein in the blood to see if they decrease after the treatment, right?
Exactly.
So it's like a deeper level of understanding beyond just the clinical outcomes.
Exactly. Now, to give you a real-world example, let's look at a phase 2 study of a drug called canagliflozin. And this is used to treat type 2 diabetes.
Okay.
The researchers were looking at its effect on HbA1c levels, which is a measure of long-term blood sugar control.
And what did they find?
Well, the study showed that canagliflozin significantly reduced HbA1c levels compared to the placebo. And this early success in phase 2 was a huge factor in the drug eventually being approved for more widespread use.
Wow, so it was like a stepping stone, this phase 2 study.
Absolutely.
It's amazing to see these trials like connect the dots between lab research and real-world impact.
Absolutely. But it's important to remember that these trials aren't done in isolation.
Right.
There's a really solid regulatory framework in place to ensure safety and scientific rigor.
So who are the key players kind of overseeing everything.
Right. So organizations like the FDA here in the US
Yeah.
and the ICH internationally, they set very strict guidelines and standards for every stage of drug development.
Okay.
So they're kind of like the guardians of patient safety,
Bad.
making sure that the data from these trials is reliable and trustworthy.
That's good to know. Gives me peace of mind that there's a system in place to ensure that scientific progress and patient well-being are both, moving forward together.
Absolutely. And that balance is at the heart of everything we do in drug development.
This has been really insightful. We've covered so much.
Yeah.
The shift from safety to efficacy, the importance of endpoints, early indicators, the whole regulatory landscape.
And we've really only just scratched the surface. I mean, there's so much more to dive into within each of those topics.
Absolutely. But for now, we'll leave you with this. As we kind of go further into this world of drug development, what questions are, coming to mind for you? What would make you feel confident in the results of a phase 2 study? Just keep those questions in your mind as we keep exploring.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating how those questions just sort of bubble up, as we peel back the layers of drug development. It's
Yeah.
like, when you go into a really dense forest, the deeper you get, the more you realize how much more there is to discover.
Right. You're so right. And those questions about what gives us confidence in a phase 2 study, I mean, they're huge because these trials aren't just about getting data. It's about making decisions, big decisions that could impact so many patients.
Exactly. A successful phase 2 trial can really set the stage for larger, more definitive phase 3 studies, which then get us closer to those potentially life-changing treatments.
Mm-hmm.
But one that's, let's say, a little less conclusive, a phase 2, might actually lead to adjustments, maybe even additional studies, or sometimes even a decision to just halt development altogether.
So what would be some of those like warning signs or red flags that would make researchers think twice about going forward after a phase 2?
Well, I think one of the big concerns would be like unexpected or severe side effects.
Okay.
Remember, while safety is the primary focus in phase 1, in phase 2, we're testing the drug on a larger, more diverse group of patients.
Right.
So this can uncover like rarer side effects that didn't really show up in the earlier phases.
I see. So we're widening the scope and catching things we might not have seen before.
Right, exactly. Another potential concern is if the drug doesn't really show a statistically significant effect on the chosen endpoints.
Okay.
Now, we talked about efficacy endpoints before, but it's really worth emphasizing that these endpoints need to really demonstrate a true and meaningful difference between the drug and either a placebo or even the standard treatment.
So it's not just about the drug showing like any effect at all. It needs to really beat the alternative.
Exactly. It needs to be statistically significant.
Right.
And that's really where rigorous statistical analysis comes in,
Yeah.
because it helps us determine if what we see is really because of the drug itself or just random chance.
Because there's always a chance of like, fluke results even in a well-controlled study, right?
Oh, absolutely. Statistical analysis helps us sort of separate the signal from the noise
Sure.
so that we can be sure our conclusions are actually evidence-based.
Okay, so let's say the phase 2 trial is, showing good things, drug is safe, well tolerated, it has a good statistically significant effect. Does that guarantee a smooth ride into phase 3?
Not necessarily. There are other things that the researchers and the regulatory agencies are looking at.
Okay.
For example, they might look at how big is that effect? Is it clinically meaningful?
Okay.
Does it really translate into real-world benefits for patients?
So, for example, if a blood pressure medication shows a statistically significant decrease, but it's like minuscule, it might not actually make a difference in someone's overall health.
Exactly. We need to see a strong enough effect to really justify moving to a big and expensive phase 3 trial.
Right, so it's like this balance between the science and just, practicality.
Absolutely. And another factor that we look at is there already a good treatment for this condition?
Okay.
If so, this new drug needs to show us something really special.
It's not enough to just work. It's got to work better.
Exactly. It's about really pushing those boundaries of medical innovation, offering patients the best options we can.
And I imagine the regulatory agencies, like you mentioned before, FDA, ICH, they're really weighing in on these decisions too, right?
Absolutely. They look over all the data from these phase 2 trials with a fine-toothed comb.
Wow.
They look at everything: safety, efficacy, was the study designed well, was the statistical analysis done correctly. They want to be really confident that the drug is a good candidate before they give the green light to phase 3.
So it's a rigorous process, a lot of scrutiny at every level, which is good. Makes me feel better. knowing patient safety and scientific integrity are at the forefront of all this.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so we talked about, the trial going well. What if it doesn't meet expectations? Is that like game over for the drug?
Not always. Sometimes a phase 2 trial that doesn't, totally hit the mark, it might lead to some adjustments or refinements. So researchers might explore different doses or test it out on different patient groups or maybe even combine the drug with another existing treatment.
So there's no one straight path. There could be detours and like unexpected twists and turns.
That's science, right. And sometimes those detours can lead to some really surprising findings, new paths of research.
That's what makes this whole area so fascinating. It's constant learning, adapting, and refining what we know.
Exactly. And even if that particular drug doesn't, ultimately get to market, the knowledge we gain from those early trials, that's gold.
Right.
It can inform so much future research, pave the way for all kinds of new discoveries.
It's like each trial, whether it's a win or a setback, it's all adding to that bigger picture of medical advancement.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And it's that collective knowledge, built on so many trials and experiments. That's what really drives progress in medicine
Absolutely.
and improves people's lives all over the world.
Speaking of those trials,
Mm.
I'm curious about the people in them. What would motivate someone to be part of a phase 2 study?
That's a great question. The motivations are all over the map.
Okay.
Some people are really driven by a desire to just help move science forward.
Wow.
They see it as a way to be a part of something bigger than themselves, potentially help people down the road.
That's incredibly altruistic.
It is. It takes a very special kind of person to step up like that, be on the front lines of medical research.
Yeah.
And for some people, it's something a bit more personal. They might be dealing with an illness and, hoping that this experimental treatment could help them, maybe even cure them.
So there's this element of hope and also, just wanting to make a difference.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important to keep in mind that joining a clinical trial, that's a big decision. And we owe a ton of gratitude to the people who volunteer. What they do is invaluable.
For sure. You mentioned earlier that these phase 2 trials, they often involve patients with a specific condition.
Right.
How are those patients recruited? And how do you make sure that the group of people in the study, they're a good representation of, the broader patient population?
Yeah, that's a super important part of designing a trial.
Okay.
And it's something that the researchers think very carefully about.
Yeah.
Patient recruitment, that usually involves working with, healthcare providers, patient advocacy groups, and even online platforms.
Okay.
It's about reaching as many people as possible. And to make sure that that group represents the larger patient population, researchers set up very specific inclusion and exclusion criteria.
Okay.
And these criteria, they really define the characteristics of who's eligible to be in the trial.
So like for a trial testing a new heart medication, the inclusion criteria might be things like age, medical history, how severe the condition is.
Exactly. And the exclusion criteria, that might, rule out people with certain other health problems or maybe people who are taking medications that could interfere with the study drug.
It's all about getting a really well-defined study group so that the researchers can draw good conclusions about, is it safe? Does it work?
Precisely. And that careful selection process, that's a huge part of making sure the results are really reliable and scientifically sound.
It's really amazing how much planning and thought goes into every detail of these studies. It's just incredible, the dedication and expertise of the research teams.
It is, and it's that commitment to getting things right that gives us confidence in the data that comes out of these trials and ultimately helps us move the field of medicine forward.
Well, I feel like we've covered a lot here. We talked about phase 2 trials, the people who take part in them.
We have.
And, all the different factors. So what are some of the emerging trends or challenges that you're seeing right now in the world of phase 2 research?
Well, one really exciting trend is the rise of personalized medicine.
Okay.
As we learn more and more about, the genes and molecules involved in disease, we're actually getting closer to tailoring treatments to each individual.
So instead of one size fits all, we're developing drugs that are like laser focused.
Exactly. They target those specific pathways or mutations that are really driving that person's illness. And phase 2 trials, they're playing a key role in this whole shift.
Gotcha.
They let us test these really targeted therapies on these carefully selected groups of patients
Wow.
and then identify who's most likely to benefit.
That's wild. It's like medicine will become as unique as each person.
It really is. And although there's still a lot of challenges to overcome, the potential here is huge.
For sure. It's so exciting to think about the possibilities. Now, besides personalized medicine, what else is shaping the phase 2 research landscape?
Well, another major development is technology. I mean, we're seeing new tools and platforms everywhere, for collecting and analyzing data,
Right.
improving recruitment, even monitoring patients remotely.
So it's making the process more efficient, more streamlined.
Exactly. And one area where technology is really having a big impact is in the analysis of big data. I mean, phase 2 trials, they generate a mountain of information.
Right.
So we have these sophisticated algorithms, machine learning tools, and they're helping us get these incredible insights from the data.
Like a super detective helping us find clues.
Yeah, a great analogy. And these insights, they can help us fine-tune our trial designs, identify potential biomarkers. I mean, we can even predict which patients are most likely to respond to a specific treatment.
It's amazing how technology is changing how we do research and develop new therapies.
Yeah.
But with all this progress, there's got to be some new challenges too, right?
Oh, for sure. One of the biggest challenges is just making sure all these fancy tools are being used responsibly. We need to think about patient privacy, data security, and even the potential for bias that can creep into these algorithms.
It's not just about having the technology, it's about using it wisely.
Exactly. And another challenge is, well, just keeping up. The field is changing so fast. Researchers and regulatory agencies have to be on their toes to make sure trials are designed and conducted to the absolute highest standards.
It's a lot to keep up with, a lot of moving parts.
It is, but that's what makes it so interesting. There's
Yeah.
always something new to learn. The possibility for a breakthrough is always right around the corner.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation.
It has.
I feel like we've explored so much about phase 2 trials.
Yeah.
The importance of the efficacy endpoints,
Mhm.
early signs of benefit, the trends, the challenges.
We've really only just scratched the surface, but hopefully
Yeah.
this conversation has given you a better understanding of how important phase 2 is in the drug development process.
Absolutely. Now, before we, wrap things up, I want to go back to something you said earlier about patient participation.
Yeah.
What advice would you give to someone who's thinking about volunteering for a phase 2 study?
Well, I would say, first of all, it's a very personal decision. There's no right or wrong answer. It's really important to weigh the potential benefits and the risks very carefully and to talk to your doctor, talk about any concerns you have.
So it's all about making an informed decision that feels right for you.
Exactly. And I would also add that, taking part in these trials, it's a really selfless act. It contributes to medical knowledge and can potentially help so many others.
It's a real gift.
It is. And to everyone who has participated or is considering it, thank you. You are the unsung heroes of medical progress.
Well said. Now, before we give our listeners a final thought, I'm curious about something. We've been talking about the different things that influence the decision to take a drug from phase 2 to phase 3, but who ultimately makes that call?
That's a great question, and the answer is it's a team effort.
Okay.
You have the research team, the pharmaceutical company that's sponsoring the trial, and of course the regulatory agencies.
So it's not just one person in a room making that decision.
Exactly. It's a very thorough process, a lot of back and forth, evaluating the data, considering the benefits and risks, and really looking at all the regulations.
It's just a good reminder that drug development it's complex and very regulated, and for good reason.
Absolutely. And that careful step-by-step approach, that's what makes sure the treatments that ultimately get to patients are safe, effective, and can truly change lives.
This has been a really insightful conversation. Thank you for being here today.
It's been my pleasure.
Yeah, it's really something, how much consideration and how many different viewpoints go into making that final decision.
Yeah.
It really shows how collaborative drug development really is.
It is. It's definitely not a solo mission. It takes, experts from all sorts of fields.
Right.
Scientists, clinicians, statisticians, regulatory folks. I mean, the list goes on.
It's like a huge orchestra. Each section is playing this crucial part to create a harmonious, outcome.
I love that analogy. And you're right that harmony is so important because in the end, it's all about getting safe and effective treatments to people who need them.
And that kind of brings me to something I've been thinking about throughout our conversation. With all the research, all the testing, all the scrutiny that goes into drug development, how do we find that sweet spot between scientific progress and the very real needs of patients, especially when, sometimes those needs are urgent?
That's a really deep question. And And it's something everyone in this field grapples with. I mean, on one hand, we have a responsibility to thoroughly evaluate new therapies, make sure they're safe, make sure they work.
Right.
We don't want to be putting patients at risk or giving them false hope.
Absolutely. It's about being careful, responsible, and making sure medical innovation is moving forward in the right way.
Exactly. But at the same time, we know that for some people, time is not a luxury they have.
Right.
They're dealing with, serious conditions, maybe even life-threatening, and there might not be many treatment options out there. So the idea of a new therapy, even if it's still being developed, that can be a real beacon of hope.
It's a delicate balance, isn't it? Like,
Mhm.
you need the science, the rigor, but you also have to acknowledge the human side of things, the need for healing, for hope.
It really is. And finding that balance often comes down to open communication,
Yeah.
between researchers, regulatory agencies, patient advocacy groups, and most importantly, the patients themselves.
It's a conversation, a dialogue, not just someone telling you what to do. It's recognizing the complexity and working together to find the best way forward.
Absolutely. And that often means exploring things like accelerated approval pathways for drugs that are addressing, really serious life-threatening conditions while still making sure that patient safety is the top priority.
So it's about speeding things up when you can, but never cutting corners.
Exactly. And it's always evolving as we learn more about diseases, develop new technologies and refine our understanding of what it takes to actually bring safe and effective treatments to the world.
It's a constant process of learning and improvement.
It is. And that's what makes this field so exciting. There's always something new to learn, and the potential for groundbreaking discoveries is always there.
This has been an incredible journey, really eye-opening, looking at drug development from those early steps in phase 1 to those critical decisions made in phase 2 and beyond.
We've just scratched the surface, but I hope our conversation has given you a little glimpse into how complex it is, the challenges involved, and most importantly, the incredible potential of this whole field.
It really has for me too. And for our listeners out there, as we wrap up our deep dive into this transition from phase 1 to phase 2, what what sticks with you? What new things have you learned? Or what questions are still swirling around in your head? Keep thinking about those things, as you continue to explore this amazing world of medicine and scientific discovery.
And remember, every breakthrough, every new treatment, it all started with a question, a spark of curiosity, and that dedication to pushing the boundaries of what's possible.